Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about one of the most interesting periods in ancient Egyptian history, the Amarna period. This was the time when Pharaoh Akhenaten, often called the heretic king, shook things up big time. Just 5 years into his reign, he made sweeping changes that turned the religious world of Egypt upside down. He pushed aside the traditional beliefs that honored many gods, and instead lifted his personal deity, Aten, to the top spot. Now, there's some debate among scholars about how long the Amarna period actually lasted. Some say it only covered Akhenaten's reign, while others think it stretched through his successors until the rise of Pharaoh Horemheb. Most experts lean towards this latter view, placing the period roughly between 1348 and 1320 BCE. What makes Akhenaten's reforms so significant is that they are considered the first real example of monotheism, worshipping just one god, in world history. As you can imagine, this has sparked both praise and criticism from modern scholars weighing in on the so-called heretic king. The Amarna period stands out because it marks a dramatic break from the usual Egyptian monarchy. When Akhenaten rolled out his religious changes, temples dedicated to all gods except Aten were shut down. Religious practices were either banned or heavily suppressed, and the capital moved from Thebes to a brand new city called Akhenaten, which we now know as Amarna. This wasn't a city built for people, it was built for the god Aten, showing just how focused Akhenaten was on his new religious vision. After these changes, Akhenaten pretty much retreated to his god's city, positioning himself as the god incarnate and dedicating his life to worshipping Aten. Everything else, his people's lives, trade deals, foreign alliances, infrastructure, even the military, took a backseat to his religious devotion. But here's the thing. Once Akhenaten died, his reforms didn't last long. His son, Tutankhamun, reversed them and brought back the old ways. Although Tutankhamun's efforts were cut short by his early death, his successor Horemheb took up the mantle with even more zeal, destroying Akhenaten and erasing Akhenaten's name from history. Let's take a step back and look at Akhenaten's background. He was the son of Amenhotep III, whose reign was marked by grand building projects like his palace and the Colossi of Memnon. These projects show that Amenhotep III had a stable and prosperous rule, leaving his son a wealthy and powerful kingdom. Initially, Akhenaten, then known as Amenhotep IV, followed in his father's footsteps, maintaining diplomacy and encouraging trade. But in his 5th year, everything changed. He altered his name to Akhenaten, abolished the traditional belief system, and moved the capital to this new city, Akhenaten, away from Thebes, which was the center of the cult of Amen. What drove this sudden change? That's a question scholars have been debating for a century. Akhenaten never explained his reasons in any of his inscriptions, acting as if it were obvious that Aten was the one true god everyone should worship. But for the Egyptians, who were used to worshipping many gods for different needs, this was a hard pill to swallow. They viewed their gods much like we view specialists today. You wouldn't ask one person to handle every aspect of your life, so why would you expect one god to do everything? Temples were central to ancient Egyptian life, not as places of worship, but as homes for the gods. Priests cared for the gods' statues, and these temples were bustling complexes that supported entire industries. When Akhenaten closed the temples, it hit these businesses hard. Nowadays, some see Akhenaten as a visionary who recognized the true nature of God, but back then he was likely seen very differently. It's quite possible his reforms were less about divine vision and more about wresting power from the cult of Amen, which had grown incredibly wealthy and influential over the years. This cult had gained power during the Old Kingdom when kings granted priests tax-exempt status and large tracts of land. Over time, this wealth translated into significant power, sometimes even rivaling the pharaohs themselves. For a king like Akhenaten to reclaim that power, he needed to undermine the priests, making them seem unworthy of their status. This could explain why he pursued the path of religious reform. There's also evidence that his mother, Queen T, and possibly his wife, Nefertiti, supported and influenced these changes, seeing them as a way to boost the pharaoh's power at the expense of the priests. Some scholars argue Akhenaten's reforms weren't truly monotheistic, but rather an attempt to suppress other cults to elevate Aten. However, this doesn't hold up when you consider past religious shifts in Egypt. Previously, Amun was elevated to the king of the gods, yet other cults continued to thrive. Akhenaten's Great Hymn to the Aten, along with his policies, clearly stated there was only one god worth worshipping. This god was so great that existing temples couldn't contain him. He needed a new city and a new temple, which Akhenaten dutifully built. And the city he built as a monument to this new vision, Akhenaten. This wasn't just any city. It was designed from scratch to be the ultimate home for Aten, the sun disk god that Akhenaten claimed was the one true deity. Built around 1346 BCE on untouched land along the Nile, Akhenaten stood midway between Egypt's traditional capitals, Memphis to the north and Thebes to the south. It was like Akhenaten was saying, "This is my fresh start, not tied to anyone else's history." Akhenaten explained in boundary steles, carved markers around the city, that he chose this spot because it didn't belong to anyone before. No gods had been worshipped there, no rulers had claimed it, and no people had settled it. For him, it was a blank slate, much like his new religion. Just as Aten was unlike any god Egyptians had worshipped before, so too was the city meant to be completely different from anything they'd built before. You see, places like Karnak were sacred to Amun, and other cities had their own patron gods, but Akhenaten was made specifically for Aten. And when you look at the layout of the city, it's clear Akhenaten wanted everything centered around his god. The city had four main areas: the North City, Central City, Southern Suburbs, and Outskirts. In the North City, there was the Northern Palace, which wasn't really a palace in the traditional sense. Instead of being a lavish home for the royal family, most of its grand rooms were dedicated to Aten. These rooms were decorated with scenes of fertile landscapes, symbolizing Aten's life-giving power, and the roof was left open to the sky so the god could enter. Meanwhile, Akhenaten and his family lived in relatively modest apartments tucked away behind the main structure. It's almost like the king was trying to make himself smaller than his god, a bold move for someone who held absolute power. The central city was where the real action happened, or at least where the bureaucracy worked. This area housed two temples, the Great Temple of Aten and the Small Temple of Aten. These weren't typical temples either. They were vast open-air spaces without roofs, again emphasizing direct contact with Aten. Surrounding these temples were offices and homes for administrators, the people keeping the wheels of government turning while the king focused on his divine mission. Then there were the southern suburbs, where the wealthy elite lived in sprawling estates, and the outskirts, where ordinary workers farmed the fields and maintained the nearby tombs. It's worth noting that these workers likely didn't choose to live there. They were probably relocated from other parts of Egypt to serve the needs of Akhenaten's dream city. But here's the thing, despite all the planning and effort, Akhenaten doesn't seem to have been built with the comfort or interests of regular people in mind. Everything revolved around Aten and Akhenaten's devotion to him. Life outside the boundaries of the city barely registered for the pharaoh once he moved there. We know this thanks to the famous Amarna Letters, clay tablets discovered in the central city back in 1887. These letters reveal correspondence between Akhenaten and foreign rulers, showing just how disconnected he became from the responsibilities of ruling. For instance, Rib-Hada, the king of Byblos, a key ally of Egypt, sent over 50 desperate pleas for help against enemies threatening his kingdom. Did Akhenaten respond? No. He ignored them completely, and Byblos eventually fell out of Egypt's sphere of influence. Another letter from Tushratta, the king of Mitanni, complained that Akhenaten sent gold-plated statues instead of solid gold ones like his father, Amenhotep III, used to send. It seems even foreign dignitaries noticed Akhenaten's lack of engagement. In some cases, Queen Nefertiti stepped in to handle diplomatic matters, But overall, the pharaoh was consumed by his religious rituals. Now, if you think about the art from this period, it reflects the same kind of dramatic shift seen in Akhenaten's policies. Amarna art is wildly distinctive compared to anything else in Egyptian history. Figures are depicted with elongated necks, arms, and strangely thin bodies. Some scholars have suggested Akhenaten might have suffered from Marfan syndrome, a genetic disorder that affects body proportions. But honestly, that theory feels a bit off. Why would Nefertiti also be shown with the same exaggerated features if it were purely medical? More likely this style was symbolic, representing the transformative power of Aten. The rays of the sun disk were believed to touch and change believers, infusing them with divine energy. Those stretched out figures may have been an artistic way of showing humans touched by the hand of Aten. One iconic example is the stele of Akhenaten, showing the royal family bathed in the rays of Aten. Each member of the family has those same elongated forms, suggesting unity under the god's influence. It's less about realism and more about conveying spiritual transformation. Interestingly, this isn't the first time Egyptian artists played with realistic styles. Earlier periods like the Middle Kingdom experimented with similar ideas, but Amarna art took it to another level entirely. After Akhenaten's death, though, things changed quickly. His son Tutankhamun reversed his father's reforms, reopening the old temples and restoring the traditional gods. Businesses dependent on temple activity sprang back to life, and the capital was moved first to Memphis, then back to Thebes. Unfortunately, Tutankhamun didn't live long enough to see his restoration efforts fully realized, so his successors, including and later Horemheb, carried the torch. Horemheb especially made it his mission to erase every trace of the Amarna period. He demolished Akhenaten, using its ruins as filler material for his own construction projects. Thanks to his thoroughness, Akhenaten's name vanished from history altogether. When future generations mentioned him, it was only as the heretic of Akhenaten,